The 14th of April, 1912, the moon hung over the largest ship ever built. In the middle of the North Atlantic, this floating colossus, said to be unsinkable, cut through the icy ocean without slowing down. Inside, people danced, completely unaware of what was coming. Crystal glasses clinked in the first-class dining room. A couple laughed on the grand staircase. Musicians played on the deck. Deep in the ship's lower levels, immigrant families from across Europe were putting their children to bed. Everything seemed as it should be. These people were dreaming, hoping to reach New York, hoping to start over. But at 11:40 that night, an iceberg silently scraped along the ship's hull. At first, no one understood what it meant. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, more than 1,500 people lost their lives. Was this really just an accident? Because that night, multiple ships had sent iceberg warnings, and the Titanic hadn't taken a single one seriously enough. A vessel anchored just a few kilometers away watched 8 distress rockets light up the sky, one after another. Instead of waking the radio operator, the officer on watch simply wrote it in the logbook and went back to his duties. That night, some doors were open, others stayed shut. And which side of that door you were on almost entirely determined whether you lived or died. This isn't just the story of a ship going down. It's the story of ordinary people who paid the price for someone else's arrogance, and no one was ever held accountable. So, how did it come to this? Why was this enormous, magnificent vessel, the one they said even God couldn't sink, racing through the North Atlantic in the dead of night? And the real question is, how many chances were there to stop it? And how many of those chances were thrown away? To understand, we have to go back a few years. In 1907, 2 men sat down to lunch at one of London's most expensive restaurants. One was J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line. The other was J.P. Morgan, the American financier who was the line's true owner. What they talked about was competition. Their rival, Cunard Line, had just launched 2 ships with British government backing the Lusitania and the Mauretania. Fast, stunning, and all over the headlines. White Star was falling behind, and they knew it. Ismay leaned across the table with a single idea. Forget speed, focus on size. It made perfect sense. A ship like that couldn't help but make headlines. The Titanic was born at that lunch. Construction began in March 1909 at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. 15,000 workers labored for 2.5 years without stopping. Marble staircases, oak paneling, a Turkish bath, and a private swimming pool for first class, a French kitchen. They weren't building a ship, they were building a floating palace. And written above all that grandeur, in invisible ink, was a single claim: this ship will never sink. Where did that claim come from? The Titanic's hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. The engineers were confident, even if 4 flooded, the ship would stay afloat. Steel, technology, modern engineering, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. Newspapers declared her unsinkable. Passengers who bought tickets slept soundly. Captains saw no reason to slow down. But the engineers had missed something. The tops of those compartments weren't sealed. If one filled with water, it spilled into the next, and from there into the one after that, like a row of dominoes. All it would have taken was one person asking, what happens if 5 compartments flood? But no one asked. The ship was perfect in every way. Why question it? After all, the newspapers had already decided. The Titanic's fate had already begun to be written at the design table before she ever left port. On the 10th of April, 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton for the first and last time. The pier was packed. Women in hats waved handkerchiefs. Photographers ran back and forth. The ship was so vast that you couldn't see one end of the dock from the other. On board, there were 2 very different worlds. In first class traveled the most powerful figures of the era. John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men alive. On his honeymoon, with his young wife, Isidore Strauss, owner of Macy's, and his wife Ida, a couple married 40 years who had never been apart. Benjamin Guggenheim, a businessman, impeccably dressed, and J. Bruce Ismay himself, there to personally oversee the voyage. In third class, the story was entirely different. Irish farmers, Italian immigrants, Finnish families, Syrian merchants. Some carried only a suitcase. Others had just a few dollars. All of them shared the same dream: reach New York, start over, build something better for their children. They were on the world's largest ship, and that alone made them feel safe. Keep that in mind. The first 2 days passed quietly. Smooth seas, cold but clear air. In the first-class lounge, the orchestra played Strauss beneath crystal chandeliers. Captain Edward Smith, a man respected by everyone, with decades at sea behind him, was on his final voyage before retirement. Once the Titanic reached New York, he would step off and never command a ship again. But on the morning of April 14, something started building up on the radio. 9 a.m. The Baltic reports. Large icebergs to the west. Captain Smith received the message and brought it to Ismay. Ismay read it and put it in his pocket. Hours later, it emerged that he'd shown it to a female passenger as though it were a curiosity, not a warning. It was never posted on the bridge. Then came a second warning from a German ship. Large icebergs ahead. Then a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh. 7 different ships sent ice warnings that day. And the Titanic didn't reduce speed. Not until it was almost 11 p.m., 22 knots, nearly full speed. The captain was comfortable decades at sea. Without a serious incident will do that. Perhaps he was savoring his final voyage. Perhaps Ismay's pressure to arrive in New York early played a role. That claim was debated for years and never definitively proven. But this much is certain: the speed was not reduced. And there had to be a reason for that. That night, the sky was perfectly clear. Stars blazed overhead. The sea was so calm it looked like glass. It sounds beautiful, but for the lookouts, it was almost a trap. In normal conditions, waves and foam form around icebergs. That's what the crew would watch for. But with the water so still, spotting them was far harder. And it would later come to light that the binoculars were locked in a cabinet. The key had been given to the wrong person back in Southampton. The lookouts were scanning that vast, black ocean with nothing but their own eyes. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood shivering in the freezing cold at the bow tower. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet grabbed the phone and called the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. But the warning came too late. A ship of 46,000 tons cannot stop on command. First Officer Murdoch made his decision in seconds. Hard to starboard, engines full astern. The ship began to turn, slowly, agonizingly. Contact was inevitable. Some passengers barely felt it. Those on deck noticed only a faint tremor, as if something had brushed past. They had no idea that slight shudder would be the end for so many. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side for about 90 meters. It didn't leave one long gash that might have actually been easier to seal. Instead, it buckled steel plates, popped rivets, and opened small seams along the hull. Water poured in, slowly but surely. Engineer Thomas Andrews went below deck. He moved through each compartment, calm and methodical. He did the calculations. Then he returned to Captain Smith's side. The ship will sink. Smith waited. A long moment passed. How much time do we have? An hour. Maybe an hour and a half. It was 12:05 a.m. There were 2,208 people on board. And on deck, the musicians were still playing. Now, I want to pause here, because what I'm about to tell you is the part that is hardest to accept. At that moment, help was within reach. Truly, literally within reach. And it still didn't come. 12:15. Captain Smith ordered radio operator Jack Phillips to send a distress call immediately. Phillips was 25 years old. His assistant, Harold Bride, was 22. Both of them got to work, sending CQD and SOS out across the ocean. Several ships responded, but they were all too far away. The Carpathia was 93 nautical miles out. Captain Arthur Rostron leaped out of bed, ordered full steam ahead, and drove his ship through iceberg-filled waters in the middle of the night. But even at maximum speed, reaching the Titanic in under 4 hours was impossible. The Titanic had maybe 90 minutes left. Now, I want to take you just a few kilometers away. The SS Californian had stopped for the night, surrounded by ice, and had been sitting in the same spot for hours. It was somewhere between 10 and 20 nautical miles from the Titanic, well within rescue distance. The radio operator was asleep. Officer Herbert Stone, on watch at the bridge, saw lights glowing in the darkness, a ship in the distance. Then a flare shot into the night sky. Then another. 8 white rockets, one after another. Stone wrote in his log, "It looks strange." He called up to wake Captain Lord. Lord asked, half asleep, what color the rockets were. Stone said white. Lord said, "All right," and went back to sleep. 8 rockets, an internationally recognized distress signal, and nobody moved. More than 1,500 people, just a few kilometers away, were fighting for their lives. And an officer who found it strange wrote it down in his logbook and went to bed. I'll let you sit with that. 12:20 a.m. Crew members were distributing life jackets. The lifeboats were being prepared. And here we have to face the hardest reality of this entire story. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Their total capacity was 1,178 people. There were 2,208 people on board. How was that possible? Maritime regulations at the time set the number of lifeboats based on a ship's tonnage, not the number of passengers. The Titanic was so unprecedented in size that the regulations simply hadn't kept up. White Star had actually exceeded the legal minimum. 16 lifeboats would have been sufficient by the rules, but they carried 20. And still, following those rules to the letter meant leaving more than 1,000 people with nothing. The people who wrote the rules had never imagined a ship like this could exist. The first lifeboats were lowered, and what happened next was almost surreal. Lifeboat number 7 could hold 65 people. It was launched with 27. Why? Because no one believed this was real. Getting into a small rocking boat and heading out into the open ocean seemed more dangerous than staying on this massive, brightly lit, still-standing ship. The Titanic's sheer size had cast a kind of spell. Passengers stood on deck in their life jackets, torn between 2 impossible choices: a fragile little boat on a freezing dark sea, or the greatest ship ever built, still towering around them. The musicians kept playing. They had been stationed there to signal that everything was under control. It wasn't. 1 a.m., water began flooding the lower part of the grand staircase. First-class passengers crowded the deck, trying to board the remaining lifeboats. Some refused. Isidore Strauss, 67 years old, stood beside his wife Ida. Crew members pleaded with him. He shook his head. Women and children first. They offered him special treatment. A man his age could be allowed on board despite the rule. He refused again. Ida stepped toward the lifeboat, stopped, then turned back and sat down next to her husband. A survivor later recalled her words, "We have never been apart. Why should we be apart now?" They placed 2 deck chairs side by side, and they sat together until the ocean reached the door. Benjamin Guggenheim had gone below and changed out of his evening clothes. He and his valet put on their finest suits and returned to the deck. He told a survivor, "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." That line breaks something in you, because these men weren't choosing to die. They were accepting that no other option had been left for them. But I want you to go somewhere else now, down to the lowest decks of the ship, because that's where the story becomes most painful. Third-class passengers had no plan. At the time, maritime regulations kept third-class travelers separated from the upper decks officially for health inspection and immigration control. That separation was physical. Locked gates, narrow corridors, partition points. And those passengers were housed at the very bottom of the ship, exactly where the water was already rising. The lifeboats were at the top. No one came down to guide them up, not until it was far too late. Families waited in corridors as the ship listed and the water climbed from below. Most didn't speak English. Children cried. Mothers held them close. An Irish woman who survived later said, "We waited down there, hoping someone would come. No one came." 97% of first-class female passengers survived. Only 46% of third-class women. Same ship, same iceberg, same night. Your survival depended on the price of your ticket. The numbers say everything, and I won't try to make you comfortable with them. 1:40 a.m. The bow was deep underwater. The deck tilted at a noticeable angle. The engines went quiet. Silence fell. Then the lights began to flicker and in many places went out entirely. 1:55 a.m. The last lifeboats were being lowered in a panic. Some of the collapsible boats couldn't be deployed properly. One capsized. A handful of people clung to it in the freezing water for hours. Jack Phillips was still at the radio. Harold Bride turned to him. "It's time to go." Phillips paused, then sat back down. A few more signals. Whether he made it off the ship is not known with certainty. He was never seen again. The musicians kept playing. Which song they played last, no one can agree on. Some survivors say it was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others remember something different, but all 8 musicians went down with the ship. None of them finished the final note. 2:17 a.m. The bow was completely submerged. The stern rose out of the water at a steep angle. From inside came sounds, people falling, metal groaning, everything sliding loose. Then the ship split in two. Between the third and fourth funnels, 3,800 meters above the ocean floor, the bow sank immediately. The stern stood almost vertical for a moment, as if pausing to take one last look, and then it too was gone. 2:20 a.m. The Titanic had disappeared, and more than 1,500 people were left in water that was -2 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the ocean kills within 15 to 30 minutes. First comes shock breathing, becomes impossible. Muscles seize. Then consciousness fades. Then something that feels like sleep. Then silence. Survivors have said there are no words for it. The screaming, dozens of voices, then hundreds, and then one by one those sounds disappear. 5 minutes, and a terrible quiet settles over the dark water. Officer Harold Lowe eventually went back. He transferred passengers from his boat to others and returned to search. But too many minutes had passed. He rescued a few people, only a few. The other lifeboats did not return. Those inside feared that if the people in the water grabbed hold, the boats would capsize. That decision haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, confessed on deathbeds, carried to the grave. 4:10 a.m. The Carpathia appeared on the horizon. Captain Rostron had driven his ship through icebergs in the dark to reach them. His crew had prepared everything they could. Doctors, blankets, soup, rope ladders. 710 people were rescued. Only 710. There are photographs of survivors climbing aboard the Carpathia. Frozen faces, empty eyes. Some sat in their wet clothes without moving. Most had left someone behind. Most didn't even know yet when they would start to cry. The Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18. Tens of thousands of people waited on the pier in the rain. Journalists shouted. Families searched the lists of names. Some found their loved ones. Some did not. Some never learned the answer. Investigations followed in both Britain and America. Weeks of hearings, dozens of witnesses, end quote. J. Bruce Ismay had survived. In the final moments, driven by instinct, he had stepped into an underloaded lifeboat. The newspapers called him J. Brute Ismay, the man who abandoned his ship and his passengers. British society never forgave him. He spent his remaining years in Ireland, out of the public eye. He died in 1937. He gave not a single interview. He offered not a single apology. Captain Smith went down with his ship. He was last seen on the bridge. Thomas Andrews, the man who designed the Titanic, also went down with her. He was last spotted in the first-class lounge, standing waist-deep in rising water, staring at a painting on the wall. He had no life jacket. No one knows why. The investigations blamed the captain. They blamed the Californian. They blamed the inadequate lifeboat regulations. But no one held the White Star Line accountable. No one questioned the system. Because for some, the system had worked. The majority of those who died were third-class passengers and crew. The majority of those rescued were traveling first class. The Titanic was not simply an accident. It was a mirror reflecting the values of an entire society. And looking into that mirror is still deeply uncomfortable. In 1914, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea Solace was signed. From that point on, every ship was required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Radio operators would keep a 4-hour watch. The International Ice Patrol was established and still monitors that stretch of the Atlantic today. None of these rules existed before the Titanic, or rather, some rules existed, but no one had imagined a ship of this scale. That gap in the regulations was precisely the abyss into which this ship fell. In 1985, a team led by Robert Ballard found the Titanic at a depth of 3,800 meters. Just as expected, it had split in two. The bow is still recognizable. The stern is scattered in pieces. In the debris field between them lie shoes, eyeglasses, wine bottles, and children's toys. A pair of boots sits upright, with the impression of feet still pressed inside, but no one to claim them. The ocean dissolved the bones, but it left the belongings behind, as if it wanted to prove those people had been there, as if it knew they shouldn't be forgotten. The Titanic still holds its grip on us, the films, the documentaries, the books, because it isn't really a story about a ship. It's a familiar story. Everything they called unsinkable eventually sank. Every system they promised would protect us turned out to protect them, not us. Warnings were received and pocketed. Rules existed, but hadn't kept pace with reality. And even in the middle of the disaster, the chance of survival came down to wealth and class. This happened in 1912. And in other forms, under other names, it is still happening. As the final signals went out over the Titanic's radio, Jack Phillips had a small notebook in front of him. What was written inside, no one knows. It was never found dissolved long ago, 3,800 meters below the surface, in the salt water. But his last transmissions remain on record. A few bursts of Morse code, a few letters, then silence. It wasn't the iceberg that sank the Titanic. The iceberg was just the final blow. The real fracture began the moment someone believed himself greater than nature. And it grew a little deeper every time a warning was dismissed, every time a gap in the rules was noticed and ignored, every time someone said, "It's enough." That night, the sea was calm, the stars were out, and the ship was moving at full speed into the dark. Remember the Titanic, and never forget this. That night, it wasn't just a ship moving through the darkness.